Welcome to all of you to the Citizens' last event of the year. I'm so happy to see all of you here. And for this event that I've been looking forward to, I'm really excited about it. So I want to thank Drexel University's Lindy Institute for Urban Innovation and the Fitler Club, who are our partners on this Development for Good event series that we do, in which we try to really look at how intentional design and development can reshape the city. And we've been doing this for the last couple years, and there seems to be some momentum around the idea, which is great. So we saw our citizenship hype video here, so I just want to take a minute to do a little bit of citizen hype. For those of you who don't know us, we are a nonprofit. We do solutions journalism and thought-provoking events like this and call to civic action, all with the intention of reviving citizenship and democracy in the American city where it was born. This work feels somehow, I'm literally talking into a mic. Do I need to shout into the mic? Is the mic on? Can you guys hear me? Okay, so we are all about, okay, now I feel like I'm really shouting. Can you hear me now? Okay. You're welcome. So we would love to include you, welcome you into our kind of army of civic do-gooders. So you can do that by becoming a member of the Citizen, by signing up for our newsletter, by reading the website every day, telling friends, coming to our next events, donating. You can even gift a Citizen membership to family and friends in this season in which people give gifts. All of that you can find on our website. You can talk to one of us who's working here from the Citizen. We'd be happy to have all of you. So our next event, I just want to tell you about. We're doing on January 30th. We have our inaugural Citizen of the Year Awards celebration. We have found 11 incredible Philadelphians who are really civic change makers in 2023, and we are going to honor them with a gala. MSNBC's Ali Velshi will be here, and he is going to be interviewing George Takei, the actor and activist. Yes, woo! So I would like to introduce our speakers. I think you guys can sit down if you want to. So Inga Saffron really needs no introduction, I think, to this crowd here. Inga has been the Inquirer's architecture critic since 1999. Or as she puts it, I write about the design of buildings and places and what those designs tell us about our culture, our values, and our policy choices. Among many honors, Inga was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize 4 times and won in 2014. And Michael Murphy, who was co-founder of the co-founder of the nonprofit architecture firm Mass Design Group, which stands for Model of Architecture Serving Society, and whose motto is "Justice is Beauty," which I think we should just take a minute to think about that. So in the U.S., Mass Design's most well-known work is the National Memorial to Peace and Justice, built with Brian Stevenson's Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama, to honor the victims of lynching in America. But Michael's work has spanned the planet. He and his team have designed hospitals in Rwanda and Haiti and Texas. They have brought their unique approach to design and building to projects for universities, monuments, and other private and public institutions around the country and world. In 2022, I think that's right before you left Mass Design Group to pursue other work, the firm won the AIA Architecture Firm Award, which I think is a big deal. Okay. So I am really excited to have you here. I will shut up and I will let Inga take over from here, and we'll have time for some questions at the end. So you'll see me again.
Good evening, everyone.
Hello.
Thank you for being here. This is a very impressive crowd. Are we sure we're not at Penn Design?
Some seats up here.
Yeah.
2 seats.
2 seats and
for
one
sale.
over there. Thank you all for coming out to talk about architecture and much more. And I thought I would start by having Michael tell us a little bit about his origin story. He met Dr. Paul Farmer, who was a founder of Partners in Health. Around the same time, your father was hospitalized with a life-threatening condition, and you were spending a lot of time in supposedly state-of-the-art American hospitals. And right around that time, Paul Farmer comes along and asks you to design a hospital in Rwanda and talk about worlds colliding. How did one experience inform the other?
Yeah, thanks for that. And thank you all for coming here tonight. What an incredible turnout, and great to be in Philadelphia. Yeah, I mean, I think, my path to architecture and design, I'm sure there's many designers in the room and be curious, probably more interesting stories than mine about your path to design. But it was this colliding world situation which kind of shocked me into thinking, what is the purpose of the built world? What does it do to us, and how can we shape it in a more productive way? Just to kind of hash what Inga was sort of paraphrasing, it was the same exact week I was finishing my first semester of architecture school. I was in my first final review session, which for the architects in the room is often a kind of 3-day sleepless charrette where you're working on drawings and models and are very myopic and trying to finish your project to then present in front of a live jury where they systematically destroy the project to tell you how terrible you are. And then you feel ashamed and you forget it all because you go and sleep. And so I was, and so I had that experience, and I was walking out of the very studio, and I had looked on my phone, and this is 2006, I think. So we had cell phones, maybe not so attached to them as we are now, but I had like 50 missed calls on the cell phone. And they were all from my mother, which I thought maybe she was trying to, tell me about what's in the oven for the evening or something. But no, it was much more kind of dramatic. The first one was, where are you? Your father is my father, who was suffering from cancer and had gone through an incredible remission, and we had had this incredible collaborative experience working on my family home, was now in septic shock, going in an ambulance from our hometown in upstate New York, Poughkeepsie, New York, to New York City. And she was, leaving the message on my phone, trying to figure out where I am. The second message was, please pick up. The third was, where are you? And I didn't know what 50 was. That I had maybe been in this experience up for 3 days, unaware of the world around me, and maybe my father had died during that period, and I wasn't even available to answer the phone. That was what hit my head, and I kind of sat down in the lobby of the architecture school to consider that, just as a friend walked in looking for me, saying my mother had called her and she was coming to find me. She said, your father's alive, but he's sick, and she drove me to the hospital just that moment. So we drove to New York from Boston, and then walked in. It was sort of this time of year. It was December 3rd, actually. And it was this period of time. It was holidays. It was the end of the semester. And and then I was in the hospital. It was sort of empty. The rooms weren't full. And we had to spend the holiday season there in kind of death watch, wondering what would happen. We had to go into surgery. We were waiting for a number of different tests. And I just remember coming out of this first semester, this is my first semester of school, coming out and being kind of overwhelmed by how much or how little design was actually there. Walking around this racetrack hallway with no windows, being told to get exercise. That was how he was supposed to get exercise. Going into these rooms without windows, but there might be a window in some other room. Having double rooms with other sick patients who were screaming out. Watching the nurses, my mother's a nurse, so I've spent time in hospitals, but watching them kind of calibrate and hack the design of the space for their own needs, it was quite shocking. And I was in this kind of center of research and cancer care place that we would all...
That was one of the better hospitals in America, right?
It's one of the better hospitals in America. It turns out it was a bed tower. It was built, turns out, in the 60s. And, had some renovations, but was still the same bed tower. So yeah, I had this moment of like complete whiplash, and it was then that I walked out of that experience saying, geez, if I'm ever going to design a building, I really think I would really love to design a hospital. And it was that same week when I had met Dr. Paul Farmer, the great visionary medical doctor who changed my life. He was doing hospitals all over the world, working with his organization Partners in Health, and he was giving a lecture at the same time later that week, and I went up to him and said, who are the doctors, who are the architects you're working with? And he said, no architects have reached out to see how they can be helpful to what we're doing. I'm like drawing hospitals on napkins, like where have you been? Is this question. And it's like these kind of series of events all happen in one single week of my life, and it's this kind of essential moment where you say, well, there's really no choice. I have to think about the spaces that maybe can help us heal better, give us dignity, or potentially be that last room. What my friend B.J. Miller talks about is how do we design that last room in our life, that place where we're going to end and move on to the next world. What does it look like? What is that experience like? How does it nourish us and nourish our families? All of that was in my mind at that moment of time, and it really changed the way I see the built world's role, something that is a profound and powerful steward for where we are in our lives, and yet often is missing some of the key things that we know as designers are essential to helping us feel a sense of dignity, a sense of citizenship, a sense of rights, a sense of beauty, and a sense of comfort.
And then you ended up in Rwanda soon after that with Dr. Paul Farmer, and you were designing or he was trying to get you to design a hospital there in very different kind of conditions than the ones you had experienced in New York. And your first attempt didn't go so well. I think I read that he said your first design looked like a barracks.
Yes,
So
yes, that's true. Yeah.
So how did you fix that?
Yeah, so then the story continues so that the next semester happens, and I stay in touch with Paul, and then he invites me to come work with his team, and they're working on facilities. So I go for the summer, instead of working at an architecture firm, I go work with this nonprofit NGO, nonprofit healthcare organization in Rwanda, and start working on little small building projects. My next semester of school, my second year, he calls me and says the government has asked them to build a new hospital from scratch in the north of the country, and they need help. Would I come and help and join them? At that point, of course, I said, of course, I don't know how to design a hospital. And he goes, well, neither did we, but we've done a bunch of them. Will be working with us, so it doesn't really matter, And so that's kind of true, actually. So I said, sure. I mean, of course, why not? When does this opportunity happen? But then originally I thought like students at the graduate school of design at Harvard and the public health school where he taught could collaborate. And so a bunch of us came together to do charrettes after class and work together. And it was a failure. We were working together and it wasn't great. What we designed was sort of blah. And
but you got it right after a while, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the reality was, and when he came to look at them and said these look like barracks, is we weren't in the country. We were designing from Cambridge. We were not on the ground. We weren't in the hospital. We weren't with the doctors, And I think we kind of knew that, except we were, obviously in school. And so I said, the problem here is that we're not really immersed in this. So what if we left? What if I left and moved to live with the doctors themselves? And so that's what I did. I left school and I moved to that northern hospital and lived with the doctors, and we designed it together in collaboration in the field, like literally living in the space that we would design this space and watch it to grow from the beginning. It kind of changed also the way I understood what the design process needs to be and should be, and how we can actually make things really quickly, creatively, and with kind of intentionality if we're in the place, what Brian Stevens would call proximate to place. Yeah.
Can you describe that hospital a little bit for people who don't know it?
Sure, and there's some image if we wanted to show it, but I don't know if we can find it. But there's this is called the Bitaro Hospital. It was finished in 2011. Bitaro is a small rural area in northern Rwanda on the border of Uganda. If you don't know Rwanda, it's in East Africa. It's a small country about the size of Maryland in landmass, but it's kind of circular, and it's surrounded on all sides, landlocked, beautiful mountain ranges where the gorillas are in the north, the mountain gorillas of Dian Fossey fame, and then on the west, the Congo. And this part of the country is incredibly remote and hilly and stunningly beautiful, and obviously lack of access to healthcare was significant. The government of Rwanda, a little context, we're coming out of the genocide of 1994, of course, where 1 million people were killed in 100 days. I mean, crazy. We talk about a state that failed. It was in utter disrepair, and in 10 years, I mean, this was 2007, a little over 10 years, they had become one of the fastest growing economies in the world. They had the most women in leadership. They had universal health care. They were investing in hospitals and schools across the country. It's a truly incredible story of transformation. Also, it's 2008, which is the, of course, financial meltdown of the United States, where all of us in the design community were losing our jobs and getting fired. We're like the first to go, especially in the housing crisis. In fact, a little background story is, I'm so happy you won the Pulitzer. I wanted to be a journalist. I ended up an architect. I studied English literature as an undergrad and then went to do architecture in grad school. And in 2008, there was a New York Times article that said, finally, architects have replaced English literature grads as the least employable profession. So I like had that on my desktop.
I think journalists are just like one notch above that. So you've designed a lot of hospitals since then, and so why do some hospitals make you feel nurtured and human, and others make you feel like a cog in a machine? I mean, is it the architecture alone? I liked in one of your more recent projects in Texas how you use the local architecture vernacular to design a family health center, and you created pavilions that mirror the local dog trot houses and that are linked with breezeways. What else do you do to make people feel homey and welcoming and less afraid? And how do you square that with medicine's obsession or real need to make patient rooms sterile and easy to clean? I mean, we have to admit that is necessary.
Yeah.
So what are the features, that make a good hospital or healthcare space?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I would just say, I'm here in the Fitler Club, and the rooms are totally amazing. They have some of the ideas of what might make us feel more comfortable. I mean, hospitality and hospital come from the same root, right? And yet, a hotel of luxury and comfort looks very different than a hospital room. So I think we actually have the skills to understand what the kind of total environment that makes us feel nourished and seen and welcomed and dignified. It activates all of our senses, all of our kind of sensory landscape, what we smell, what we see, what we hear, what we feel. These are the things that we as designers think about, and a lot of that gets pulled out of a sterile environment like a hospital when the primary motivation is sanitation and cleaning and the kind of functionality and turnover. So I understand why that resistance is there. In fact, I think what's so interesting and challenging about the medical space is that it's always balancing these two demands, one that's serving the person, the bedroom, and the kind of comfort that a patient needs to feel in order to actually heal. But then it has to also be this kind of factory of public health where you're getting medicine and research and turnover and emergency. And so it's always doing both. It has this dual life. And so I found this really particularly fascinating, that's always serving the public health and the personal health, and sometimes and often in an imbalance. Now, you might find incredible places. I think the work that Maggie's Center, for example, in England, where they're taking the cancer care out of the hospital and putting them in bespoke and unique and beautiful infusion centers adjacent to hospitals, are like a pretty clear example of where you can design this space of comfort and still have the kind of active public health center that has medicine and science and is sanitized and it also has to be operating at a high fidelity. And both of them can be adjacent and in collaboration. But the integration of them, we see it often. I think without a vocabulary, we can't push on why hospitals make us feel so alienated. Last thing I'll say is before we get out of the fire alarm, sorry, is the other thing I'll say is that the sense of feeling institutionalized was a sort of big effort in, especially the mid-century, is trying to make spaces more comforting, but that really meant less institutional. And when we feel institutional, we feel unseen, we feel undignified, we feel like we're part of this the cog in this big machine. And our hospitals very much make us feel that way.
Yeah. It's kind of ironic because I was looking at your book on the history of hospital design, and actually when hospitals became sterile and clean, that was a big, big advance in human civilization because, you know, they used to be pigsties, right? So that was a good thing when they began to focus on keeping them sterile and doing that. But in some ways, I guess people got carried away with with that aspect of it and the impersonal aspect of it.
I think it's a question of scale. Mm-hmm. You know, the bigger the institution gets, the harder it is to reach the individual unit. Mm-hmm. And so there's clear examples of medical facilities that were designed at a certain scale for a certain amount of beds, and they work really well. Mm-hmm. And then when they add 10 more buildings, they become these vast bureaucracies, these vast labyrinthine institutions, and it's really hard to find yourself inside the maze. And they're quite literally mazes. Mm-hmm. They're quite literally these impenetrable systems that we can't figure out how to find our way through or navigate the system itself.
Right. There's never enough space. And they're always like putting stuff in the hallways, right? Machines and beds.
Yeah, that's right.
So since your early work with Paul Farmer, you've developed a whole philosophy around designing healthcare buildings and other kinds of buildings that go well beyond this problem of creating comfortable human spaces. And your designs are heavily focused on sustainability, both the environmental and the economic kind. Your Rwanda Institute for Conservation Agriculture is built entirely with local materials, using local labor. And one of the benefits of doing that is that countries without a lot of hard currency don't have to import a lot of materials, but from foreign countries. But it must take an incredible amount of work and organization to design that way. And how do you coordinate with local craftspeople so that you can design what they're capable of building?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I give all credit to my team who have been trying to ask these questions locally. I mean, I'll say that from the outset, what we learned in the Batara Hospital, the first project, was we didn't actually have enough capital to do it the other way.
Mm-hmm. To import foreign materials, plastics.
This is where we learned this point, which was it was to hire a bulldozer to come up and excavate the hill from the Capitol was like $10,000 a day, and it would have taken a number of weeks. But if we hired all hand labor from the local communities and we rotated as like a workforce program, we could do it in half the time and half the cost.
And did you use any rammed earth or earth construction?
Not on the Batara Hospital, but
on
we
other ones,
on future projects we've worked on earth block construction and rammed earth. Mm-hmm. And a big piece of that is change the way I understood the kind of relationship between the material world and the labor world and the economics of the built environment. You know, so much of what we're talking about here in the U.S. is about prefabricating the process in order to reduce the cost of, reduce the cost of the project overall. But what it's reducing the cost of is labor, because labor is expensive and material is cheaper. But Rwanda was the inverse. Material is expensive and labor is cheap. So if we're like importing a methodology that's very specific to our economy, it actually doesn't leverage the full capacity of the asset that we might have on the ground, which is maximizing labor. Every material has a labor footprint and a material footprint. And I think it was there that I started to realize, like, oh, we're not actually, when we're talking about environmental impact, we're not fully talking about the impact on people. Everything is made by a hand. The human handprint is a foundational idea of architecture that's always been there in some way. We call it craft, or we call it the kind of care of making, but it is about people touching and working on and constructing the world around us. It's a much more emotional thing, actually, than just counting how many bodies are there in the practice of construction. And so I started to think that we're actually at a precipice. You know, we've had this, at that point, incredible commitment to environmental and sustainability. We've sort of at the point in the green building movement in 2006, 7, and 8, where, you know, people like my mother would ask, like, is the building green? You know, without really understanding, like, necessarily the complexity of LEED certification. I think that's a good thing. We're at a point where people, everyday people, are asking a question of, like, what's the environmental impact of a structure? We needed to make the next leap, which is people in the public understanding and asking the question of what's the impact on our communities or on people themselves of the structures around us, and how are they constructed? What's the labor quotient of that project?
And who's doing the construction?
Who's doing the construction?
Yeah, yeah.
And that question, I think, what you call like it's almost like if you look at the slow food movement, which I think is 10 or 20 years ahead of the building movement, they're asking that question about sustainable food. It's about farmers, it's about earth, it's about what we put into our bodies, but it's about ultimately binding the thing on your plate to the regional economy around you. And architecture used to be made from that. We can walk down Philadelphia streets and we can talk about where these bricks were made and the foundries on the river. We can talk about the unique labor that was imported to do a certain type of masonry work. And there's narrative and story about people and culture within every structure. And so we need to elevate that. We need to build the slow space movement that my friend has coined and sort of push forward what we've seen in slow food. Is so architecture is actually about reconstructing and ritualizing the commitment to the places in which we live.
Right. So when we talk about sustainability, we tend to talk about, how much carbon is used to produce some material. But sustainability can also be about who's building it. Are they local? Is the money going into the local economy? Is it preserving certain craft skills? And that's something that's harder to talk about, especially in America. Have you been able to apply what you did in Rwanda, where you used a lot of local labor, to anything in America?
Yeah, great question. Again, the economies are different, right? So the cost of labor and the cost of materials have to be kind of inverted sometimes, but that doesn't mean we can't invest in key elements that show the human handprint of the world. So in the Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, we thought critically about this, and there are really two key design elements that really show the hand. The first is that all of the walls of the structure are made from what's called board form concrete walls. So we put boards together, you pour concrete within it, and then you take the boards off, and often the remnant or the imprint, the negative imprint of the wood board is left and revealed. You can see it, I think, in this building in some places. But so we chose wood from 19th century Alabama barns, which were constructed from pine. A lot of the cotton plantations became pine forest plantations, pine plantations that harvested wood after the cotton economy kind of fell. And a lot of that became pine forest. And a lot of that wood became the structures of the buildings throughout Alabama. And so
that has a lot of meaning.
Has a lot of meaning. So then we insisted that we make every one of these walls with that wood. And so the remnant that you see has this story about a piece of wood that was harvested from a barn that was built in a farm, with wood from that farm that was built on top of or grown on top of cotton soil that was harvested by enslaved African Americans. And each of that hand is in every piece of the wall. And so I think we can tie that story beyond just like, oh, we hired this many folks from this community, and we can talk about the long trail of impact. So that's one example.
Yeah, that's an incredible example. Let's just talk a little bit about your approach to architectural practice, because there are very few architects who have done it the way you do it. Most people who hear the name mass design probably think it refers to WAIT or maybe the state of Massachusetts. Actually, it's a model of architecture serving society. And from the very beginning, you organized your firm as a nonprofit. And I know architecture is not very lucrative under any circumstances.
No.
And many architects might joke that they too run a nonprofit, but you really
That's right.
did.
Most do. When I say we were nonprofit,
You
they say, so are we.
You really were
Yeah.
a nonprofit firm legally. Why did you organize it that way? And what did it allow you to do that other firms can't do?
It's great to talk about that. I mean, the joke has depth in it too. You know, we're like, actually, as the design professionals, we don't make enough really to survive, and the business model is, in some ways broken or is struggling to succeed. When the 2008 crisis happened and all architects lost their jobs first, there's a sort of kind of clear evidence that the business model isn't supporting the kind of the community that needs to think about the world around us and be paid to do so. We set it up as a nonprofit because we, in essence, had to. We didn't have a fee from designing the first hospital. We were nested within another nonprofit. So I actually had to raise money just to pay for our own time and our own staff. And by force of necessity, to get people to come over that had more expertise than I did to actually complete the project, I was reaching out to grants and other philanthropic donors who might support the Partners in Health, the organization, to help see if they could support us. And that's, in essence, why we started it as a nonprofit. Not necessarily thinking that we'd have this broad ambition, but that we needed to find the money to actually finish the first project. When we finished it, then there was some clear conclusions, right? That were things we discovered through the process. One, that there's this whole marketplace of work happening around the world and in our communities done without the professional services of our discipline. I would call this the small sliver, the community-based nonprofit organizations. We have institutional nonprofits, that pay for designers, hospitals and universities, et cetera. But the small community-based nonprofits, many of which some of you may be a part of, can't afford to pay for architects. And they can pay for it if they raise the money, but they can't afford to pay for the pre-development, pre-design services that are essential to determining whether they can afford to build anything in the first place. That's really interesting market problem. And it's not their fault. So what happens? They call a board member who has an uncle that's a designer, and that board member uncle, does a few sketches, and then they see if they can build that thing. That's not a good way to get great design because it doesn't iterate with the organization as it's evolving and changing. So we uncovered this unique market that I think has largely been unserved. It turns out, of course, a lot of architecture firms are doing that work all the time. They're doing donated work, pro bono work, and they're trying to help these great groups get to a place where they can construct something. It might be small, but it's essential for community and social services. So we realized in that space with third-party capital from philanthropy that we could actually contribute and pay for that service and not sort of lie about the cost of doing that work, but actually do it with a professional intent, with expectations and contractual obligations, but have no fee for the pre-development work. If that was successful, then we would assume the entity was able to raise the money, and then they would pay us the architectural fee for the rest. So it's a kind of sliding scale afterwards. And that's how we did the memorial in Alabama. Donated all of the pre-development conceptual work, and then once we raised the money to build the thing, then we were paid our architectural fee overall.
That's really interesting. There is a group here under the umbrella of AIA Philadelphia called the Design Collaborative, and they do very similar kind of early design work and help various organizations with not much money think about their project in ways that would they couldn't do on their own. And
Yeah, my hope is that this is a model that's replicated.
Yeah.
And especially in our local communities, it's essential because there's this whole swath of infrastructure happening that needs the support and can't get it because the finances are backwards. You know? And yet there's all these incredible young professionals who are trying to make their way and are perfect to test it out with these entities. So I actually think it's the fastest way to practice instead of going to work for a big firm for 20 years and getting licensed and then moonlighting with a competition. I always encourage young students to like go volunteer for a nonprofit, and they'll probably have their own practice in 5 years faster than they would as working on a kind of traditional route.
And once those small groups had a clear design or master plan, then they can go fundraise for it, right? And
yeah, that's right. I mean, in essence, the other thing I learned, maybe this is my English literature background, is that what we're actually doing is helping them tell their story. You're not just like building something, you're helping force the issue to help narrate the future that they want to be a part of. It's a strategic development. It's a strategic planning effort. And it needs visualization in order for us to understand the place where we're trying to aim towards. And that work it's integrated as strategic planning, visualization, and then planning for a piece of infrastructure. I mean, a lot of these nonprofits, this is the biggest and only capital project they'll ever do. So it's also kind of starting over every single time, and you're working with clients that have never been clients before, which can be a real asset and opportunity to do something really big, but also can repeat a lot of mistakes and make a bunch of errors as well. So it's a risky thing, but it's also something I think that can be really profound and exciting for an entity that is making that big investment.
yeah, I've seen, the Design Collaborative here has launched a lot of good projects that would never have happened otherwise. Now you've left mass design, at least on a day-to-day basis, to start a firm that sounds very much like a hybrid of architecture firm and development, but with a social justice mission. And how is that going to work? And why are you doing it? And how will it work?
Yeah, so I mean, I think this model of practice where we try to fill in and offer design services in order to catalyze some of these organizations to build the things they need to survive, I think it works, and I think it should be replicated, and I'm really proud of that. I did learn another lesson, though, which is that if we just build the thing and it's successful, I learned this in Montgomery, where we were struggling to raise all the money, we finally built it, and it's been incredibly successful, if you want to call it that. We've had 2 million visitors to Montgomery. I mean, people told us no one would come to Montgomery. We've had 2 million visitors.
Does everyone know what we're talking about with Montgomery, the Peace and Justice Memorial? A lot of people call it the Lynching Museum. A picture would be good. I'm not in control of that.
I don't know.
Sorry, there's no picture, but it's gotten a lot of attention. I think it was named the most important building by the New York Times, is that right? In the last year or something like that?
Mark Lamster.
Mark Lamster.
Said something nice about it.
Yes. Anyway, it's a very important building. You should go there. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, and it's designed. We all credit to Brian Stevenson, who was the head of Equal Justice Initiative, and he was the visionary behind it. And their work is amazing, and I encourage you to visit it. It's quite powerful as an experience. Yeah.
So you did that, and then you started to realize that there were ways to capitalize on that in a way that an architecture firm would not normally.
Yeah, I mean the challenge there. You have a nonprofit that we were seeking to support. They bought all the land. They built this incredible memorial. We have 2 million visitors. You've had $2.5 billion in economic in tourism revenue for the state of Alabama since it opened. The city of Montgomery, which is kind of like the city I grew up in, Poughkeepsie, New York, has seen better days. It lost a lot of population. It's got kind of empty lots downtown. Had no economic development initiatives. Nobody was building housing. Now, of course, you have 6 hotels going up to capture all that tourism and all of this visitation.
And that's all being built by private developers.
It's all being built by private developers. You've got restaurants and housing and investment. The city planner told me, the story sticks in my head.
Planner singular.
Yeah, there was one planner. And they were so excited about the project. And she said to me, we're like, this might be so inside baseball, but we're so close to having enough hotel keys to attract the family reunion market. But which is a huge thing. Like huge family reunions come in, they take over a city. But we don't have enough, we've been evaluated, we just don't have enough keys, so we can't attract that. With this memorial, we can get one more hotel and have enough keys, and we can attract this whole other tier of conventions. So I was just thinking about the way in which they're imagining the economic stability of the place and what they can attract with their capacity. It was kind of amazing, And and so I think it's been incredibly successful. We've been humbled by the outcome. And yet, as nonprofits, all of that development has been happening by private developers. No critique of private developers, but the risk, I just talked about it, the risk was taken by the nonprofits, right? The risk was absorbed by us donating our own energy to see if something would happen, and of course, Brian Stevenson's organization taking all the risk, right? And that's fascinating. It reminded me that actually nonprofits and social service organizations are in those in your communities, in your neighborhoods, taking a huge amount of risk. They're stabilizing place, they're making sure there's foot traffic and security and energy and a purpose, but they're also absorbing risk for those who might want to invest in the place. And yet they don't capitalize on that investment. They can't because of their structure. We can't get a promote, as you would use in development terms, or we can't get paid back for that investment and that risk. In fact, we're back at the till every year to raise the capital to do it again. And that, to me, I couldn't shake it. It's sort of like what artists do, right? Artists are in communities, they're taking up huge loft space, they're doing their work, and then they make it safe in a way for investment to come in, and yet they get no benefit, and then they get forced out. That's the kind of classic narrative, right? So how can we actually change that narrative where those who are creating the infrastructure of stability are actually paid for their investment and are able to capitalize and exchange that value, whether they choose to stay or not? And I think that's completely possible. So the new entity I couldn't actually do it in the nonprofit structure, so I spun out to start this new project.
So how is this going to work? It sounds that you're talking a little bit about some kind of entity that's a lot like a community development corporation.
Yeah, or a trust. A trust, yeah. Except, and here's
It's going to have design as its foundation.
Yeah, I'll give you an example. So there are vehicles in foundations that we can actually use not just as donations, but as investments. And that's really interesting because foundations and donor advised funds can actually be investors in projects and actually make return. What that means is that their value set is related to impacts, social or environmental or health outcomes, instead of just maximizing return. So these are patient impact investors. Why couldn't we capitalize on that interest and that expectation and bring them in to provide that risk investment in development so that we can actually change who owns the built environment itself? In other words, if we were successful, community members could have a small equity stake in the success. Artists could have an ownership stake. And there's some entities starting to do this where you can build part of the financial stack where I'm a neighbor, I could put $500 into the project, the new development next door, and I'd get an equity stake in the development. And so my interest would change from wanting to resist the development to actually hoping for its success, and hoping it gets more return instead of less return.
And presumably if you have a $500 equity stake, you have some say in the details, right?
Yeah, you become part of a pool that has skin in the game, in a way. And so ownership and the access to land is the core of this country. It's the core of our sense of citizenship, right? White landowning men were those who could vote, only until recently. So if we're going to address some of our deep systemic injustices in our country, we also have to be really critical and change the dynamics of how we think about ownership and how we distribute it more effectively. And it begins at not just the design of the building, which is important, but the design of the system that's going to fund the building. And so I'm moving a little upstream in this new practice to change the way we think about investment. And then, of course, great architecture and design has to be there for us to see an ecosystem that is actually about transformational change. But without changing the financial commitment at the front end, we're not fully going to have that transformational change with the projects that we put in the world.
Did you tell me that you're working on a project in Poughkeepsie involving a food market?
Yeah, so I learned, I first thought about this. My hometown of Poughkeepsie, New York is what I would call one of these third-tier cities that lost most of its population, didn't have development investment for 50 years, has had all the kind of demographic and social ills that we see in these third-tier cities that have lost a lot of manufacturing base. And yet it has these great anchor institutions, Vassar College, Marist College, it's on the Hudson River, it's got the train, it should be thriving, and yet it isn't. And yet I love it and want to commit to it. And I wanted to figure it out. So I was like, what if we became owners and buy one of these dilapidated buildings that's been sitting empty for years? In fact, there were so many dilapidated buildings, there was 150 empty storefronts on the main street. And so we put a team in one of the empty storefronts, a sort of pop-up shop, and they work there, and they continue to do great work there. And but they're empty buildings. One of the buildings fell over in a windstorm, like literally fell over on top of our office.
Nobody heard, I hope.
Nobody heard, but really terrifying. That's the kind of state of it. So we said, what if we partnered to buy a building and start to turn it into an activated space? And we did that, and we became owners. And yet, through the process of trying to get other investors to finish the raise, all the investors were scared of our nonprofit ownership, because as a nonprofit, we had to own 51%. So we couldn't get the other investors really in there. Without a pool of, let's say, impact investors present and available at that time at the ready to come and join us. So we had to sell our share and get out of the project, which really taught me a hard lesson, which was the system is much more complicated if we're in this structure of the nonprofit to be an owner, and we want to change that. So I learned hard way there. It was built. It's now built. We did design it. It's working and thriving.
And there's a food market.
There's a food market and a co-working space. So, we still were the architects, and that's really terrific, and we're really proud of it.
That must be a big deal for Poughkeepsie.
It's a big deal for Poughkeepsie. Go on up. Check it out. Get some pizza.
Has it leveraged other development?
Yeah, I think people have seen it. This was pre-COVID, and so now people are sort of starting to see the Hudson Valley differently. Kingston, New York, across the river is the second fastest growing, real estate boom in the country, next to Boise, is something I read. But not Poughkeepsie. Poughkeepsie's still holding strong. So we still got work to do.
It's only a blink of an eye. One minute you're a depressed city, the next minute you're over-gentrified.
Yes, it's true. Yeah.
It's hard to keep that middle space.
Well, I think it's just a testament that, to a reminder that all of our places, neighborhoods, and cities are they're always evolved. They're always constantly in a state of change. And so we who work in the built world, we have to remember that we're intercepting and investing at a moment in time for another generational change. We work in generational change. We work in a time horizon that's 20, 30 years, not Twitter time, We work in building time. And that's, I think, a superpower of the design professionals, because we're working and thinking about the long future, not just 4 years from now, what's going to happen. We're thinking about 15 and 20 years from now. And so that work, the hard work of trying to figure out, and there's so many people in this room, I'm sure, who do this and kind of assemble all of the crazy pieces together to see if they can invest in something and transform it. That powerful work actually has transformational change for generations to come and is necessary to do. And it takes time and energy, but it's so powerful if it works.
Yeah. So I wouldn't be an architecture critic if I didn't get you to talk about design issues. Besides being humane and sustainable, your buildings are often formally beautiful and ambitious. And I'm thinking particularly of the Cholera Treatment Center in Haiti, with its diamond-shaped pavilions and these screens that allow air to pass through but also glow at night. And I hate to say this, and I hope I won't offend anyone in this room, but a lot of architecture built for poor people in Philadelphia and in much of America is very bluntly functionalist with no style or charm. And I would say even amongst certain social service groups, there's even a feeling that design detracts from the mission, that it costs money. So you get these barracks that Paul Farmer warned you against. What is your take on this? And what do you tell? How do we make better architecture for various low-income communities and organizations?
Yeah, thank you for that compliment, but also thanks for saying that, because I actually learned how to try to answer this question internally and externally through Paul, who talked about the same challenges that he was pushed to address with pretty much the same question, which was, how can you pretend to think we can provide the best health care in the world to the poorest communities out there? He would argue, like, why isn't this rural Haitian community, Haitian individual in the mountain town able to get the cancer care that we're providing to individuals at Brigham and Women's in Boston? Why is that a reality? And all of you in the room might be like, well, because we can't afford it, it's hard. And he would not accept that as an answer. He would say, no, that's not the right answer, because if we accept that as an answer, we accept that inequality is acceptable in a way. We accept that some people deserve more than others. He called it the socialization of scarcity. It's a really powerful idea. It's a notion that, like, if we internalize that there are scarce resources in the world and that only some can afford, can deserve some of those resources, and only some can afford those resources, and therefore others cannot. And if we accept that, then we accept the kind of all of the inequalities of the world around us. Healthcare is an example where if we call it a human right, then we force it as a right, we talk about it as a right, then we are questioning the notion that inequality should exist at all, that scarcity should exist at all. So to answer your question about design, we have that same problem, right? Architecture has been treated as a luxury good that only some can afford, that nice stuff is more expensive stuff. But that's not actually true. Like, great design, in fact, the whole modern movement was about simplifying things to be thoughtful and considerate and intentional, but with less ornament, with less detail, with less sort of excess. And that was our experience as well, like designing it with intent, designing with the constructed stones hand cut by local community members was actually cheaper than designing it in the way that the national standard was suggesting we designed the hospital in Rwanda. And so in Haiti, it was the same thing. We built it for very, very cheap, but we worked with metal workers that were working in that hospital to create these screen systems, and we fabricated them by hand, and it actually cost, I think, $50 a square foot to build it that way. We just had intention and cared about it and wanted to function and perform. I think what it taught me, though, is that we actually have to question the very notion of what we would call that false dichotomy, that false binary, that you have beauty or function. That's actually a false idea. I encourage you, when you are faced with that very question, to think about it, because I have to do it to myself, because I think about it that way also. It's socialized internally in me. And I have to remind myself that, when I talk about things as too expensive, I'm reproducing for the public around me that I'm talking to that some people deserve more than others, because some people can pay for beauty and some people can't. Where if we talk about beauty as a right, beauty as justice, that the search for justice is the search for beauty, then we're actually suggesting that beauty is a thing that we all deserve. Dignity is what we deserve. A right to dignity can be entrenched in law. It is actually. In Germany, after the war, they entrenched human dignity as a fundamental right in German law. In Norway, they've done the same thing. And because of that right to dignity, they're changing the way they design prisons. Right? They're changing the way they design public housing. Because they can't imagine that someone in the prisons that we export in the United States has any dignity left. So that's actually changing their infrastructure. So I think the argument is not to say how can we afford to do that, but it's actually how can we afford not to do that? That was Paul's question. How can you afford not to have architecture? That's the question we should be asking. And therefore push towards not just more beautiful things, but push for a change in our policy and a change in our dialogue about what we deserve as individual citizens.
Inga, I think we should.
Have I gone on too long?
Well, I think I did promise that we would have time for a question or two.
Absolutely,
so if that's okay.
yes. Yeah, I'm fine with that.
And there are people.
Well, thank you, Inga, for those great questions. Thank you. Someone has a question here.
Oh, wait.
Yeah, and thank you all
That's
for being here.
I
Thank
think
you.
we're going to do some audience questions.
Yeah,
Sorry?
I'm going to take a couple audience questions before you go, if you guys can stick around for that.
Hi, Roxanne. So first, thanks to the Citizen, as always, for being one of our Philadelphia gems and putting these events on. Thank you.
Yeah,
You're
thank you,
welcome. Thank
Citizen.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you to you and Larry. Inga, to you, thanks for being a voice for good design, good architecture, good planning in this city for a long time. And Michael,
Thank you.
the work that you're doing is fascinating. I've looked into it a little bit. But what really interests me is, as someone who designed what was was delivered potentially what was a death sentence in 2008 with a cancer diagnosis, your mother and her colleagues became my favorite people on the planet Earth. And nurses are the best thing going. Wonderful, wonderful folks. A lot of what you have said here is fascinating. I do community development in the poorest neighborhood, the poorest zip code in the city, in this city, the poorest zip code. We are under tremendous pressure financially. The second Philadelphia Amtrak station is the center of my universe. We are looking at being an outpost of New York City in 10 to 15 years. Broad and Lehigh, Broad and Allegheny, okay? So a lot of what you're saying here is ringing. What you've said about architects and their financial structure. I had thank you very much, because I need that, thank you. So as a nonprofit, thank you, sir. As a nonprofit, collaborative pen praxis is tremendous. What can we do you think, to influence what is an intrinsic, institutionalized, systemic system of profit by developers and a government that backs that system? What can we do to get control of that on a local level? And some of the things that you've talked about tonight, I think, are applicable. But do you have a footprint for me to follow that I can encourage other people who do what we do to also adopt? Thanks.
Thanks for that question. Also, thanks for sharing the story of your own healthcare journey. I know we all have those, and it's profound and existential. I'm assuming, and forgive my naivete about my understanding of Philadelphia. So I'm assuming what you're talking about is a neighborhood in transition. Is that right? Or like potentially getting a piece of infrastructure that could transform the neighborhood and transform it. Yeah, and so I think, and whether that transformation is going to be a good thing or a bad thing or positive or negative, it's probably all those things in a way. I think it's, and by the way, I think all neighborhoods are kind of facing this in some form or another, but some more dramatic than others. When you get necessary and important piece of public infrastructure, what a public good, and yet it transforms the neighborhood makeup as we know it. I think that is the question we saw in Montgomery, and that's why I think this idea of changing ownership structure now is such a critical piece. So one thing we're trying to do is create, in this project in DC, in Congress Heights, which is a neighborhood that also has seen little investment for the last 50 years. Yeah, so this thing called a community equity endowment, which would give community members who have lived there and been members of the community a stake in the new development that's been, put out by RFP to take the old St. Elizabeth's Psychiatric Center, which has been been gutted of copper and been empty for 60 years, and been an eyesore and a resistance to development. Create a fund that when this new development goes up, that we can drive and design together with these partners, foundation partners, that there is a fund for someone who's a member of the place. No, we're talking about trust building, land trust. Organizations have had examples of this. There's a great group called Small Change that's trying to do this with other projects. I think there's a lot of groups trying to figure this out incrementally. So I would push you to look at. But yeah, but I would say we're trying to think about it at scale so that it can be generated by a fund that we can raise capital from and then deploy on projects such as this anywhere in the country. Yeah. Yeah.
I think we can take one more question if that's okay with you. Oh my goodness. Okay.
Thank you. So you spoke about stories of people and culture in a lot of your projects, and I feel like architects often pour their heart and soul and do all this research and put so much effort into those stories, but I feel like not everyone actually hears about them. Like, you shared an example really well. How do we capture those stories and share them out to the world so people know the value as architects we can provide to our clients and to our projects?
Oh, I love that question. Thanks for saying that.
Oh, that shows well.
I have come to believe that architecture is a narrative vessel, that it is a built manifestation of the story of place and people, and that we care about the buildings that are around us if we know the stories that made them. My great-grandfather came from, one of them, Ireland, as a stonemason to build this estate in Millbrook, New York, called the Hitchcock Estate. It's made of these huge stones, these river stone masons that were unique to County Cork. Came over and actually became the labor force of these big estates. The Hitchcock Estate turns out to be the place where Timothy Leary ended up dropping all his acid and all these other things. It became this incredible place in the future. But I'm still bound by this narrative of masonry and labor and hand creation, and it's now that has so much more meaning to me because I know individual hands, including those of my ancestors, touched them. And I think when we look around the world around us, and tour of Philadelphia is so much of this, the beauty of what's made and what remains is so powerful. It's the stories that keep us wanting to retain that and also build new narratives. I think your challenge is, and thank God you have Inga here, because we were losing all of these architecture critics across the country, and you guys have done amazing work making the Inquirer a nonprofit and all this other exciting stuff, and citizens, thank you. We need more of this narration because we don't understand it and we don't have a vocabulary for how to read the built world around us. We say, I like it or I don't like it. We say it's beautiful or it's ugly. That's not a diverse and rich vocabulary of how to articulate difference, right? When you ask someone what's your favorite building, they probably tell you a story of why they love it and when they entered it and what it made them feel like. And, oh, I heard this story about how it was made, and it might not be working well now, but it was made with this great intent and this great theory. That's how we understand the world around us. And so we need to be able to narrate that. And I think buildings do that for us. So I hope we can do more of that and change the vocabulary about how we understand the world.
So unfortunately, we have to stop there. But thank you all so much for joining us here.